Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of The Democratic View. Again, I am the hostess. My name is Phyllis Italiano, and I have been interviewing someone who has an enormous story to tell us, and we have been listening to him, and you will be seeing that show as well as this one. And the name is here's the book, Glow Kids, and it's Nicholas Karadaras, doctor. Must not forget that, because that's quite an achievement.
Yeah.
So you were telling us about your life as I guess, addict.
Sordid nightclub owner that turned into a drug addict that wound up in the intensive care unit and almost died. Yeah. So that can be an eye-opening experience, and yeah.
That must have been, to be in intensive care.
Yeah.
And really at the point of almost dying.
I had always been really obsessed and curious about white light experiences, and I'd always, you read about them, and in a strange way envious about them. I had always been envious reading about people that had white light experiences, and I came as close to death, at Cornell Presbyterian. They told me I set the record for how long my heart had been stopped for and being resuscitated back to life. And by the way, they were convinced that I was going to have permanent neurological brain damage. They told my family to expect me to be in a vegetative state. And the only permanent brain damage that I've suffered is I suffered significant hearing loss in my one ear, which to this day is part of my reminder of, hey, this is what your life had been about. I didn't have a white light experience, but when I woke up, when I remember gaining consciousness in that cardiac unit after 2 weeks in the ICU, they transferred me to the cardiac unit, and I was in a room with Larry King's brother, who said, "Hey kid, you made it." And I said, where am I? And they said, you almost didn't make it, you had an overdose. And I said, what? I didn't remember any of it, but I just remembered feeling something profoundly had shifted within me. I didn't remember. There was no white light, there was no friends at the pearly gates, but I remembered thinking I wasn't put on this earth to keep living the way that I'd been living. And I also remembered a real existential thirst. I woke up and I just felt really thirsty because I had touched the void and was really curious. And at that point, I don't know if I'd mentioned, 3 of my closest friends had died in an 18-month period through overdoses and accidents. And so I was profoundly curious about this thing we call life. And so as soon as I got released from the hospital, I started going to the local library. This is back when libraries still had books and were not digital. And I started getting every book I could on comparative religions, metaphysics, theology, consciousness research, just voraciously reading. I was really thirsty to understand it better. Necessarily got myself attached to a 12-step program just to make sure that I stayed on the right path. And in that process, got a sponsor. My sponsor helped me get my life back on track, and I started feeling a sense of purpose again. In the 12-step program, baked into that program is a sense of connectivity and helping other people. And that started being really soul satisfying to me in a way that none of the other stuff had ever been. And so a friend of mine suggested, hey, why don't you go back to school and start studying some of this stuff? I said, I don't know where this path may lead to, but I know if I don't keep growing and searching and exploring and learning, I'm going to wind up, and this time I'm not going to be the miracle. I'm not going to make it. So the first suggestion was get your master's degree in social work, because you could work in addiction, you can help other people. It's kind of the professional track for some people in recovery. So I got into Stony Brook School of Social Work, and
which is quite a good university, by the way.
Yeah, and yeah, it was great. And I was that student that was so sitting at the front of the class, so happy to be in school, because I wasn't at that point. Now I'm 36. I'm an old 36. I've been around the block 36. And so for me to be in school was a really conscious choice And so I was the one asking questions and becoming friends with my professors. And sure enough, they hired me. As soon as I graduated, they hired me to teach at Stony Brook as soon as I graduated. But they said, why don't you keep going? You know, and being an addict, I like to overdo things. So I said, you know, you might as well go get a doctorate. And because I was interested in philosophy and religion and psychology and the intersection of those three, somebody had told me that transpersonal psychology was the intersection of those things. I didn't want to be a behaviorist. I didn't want to be B.F. Skinner. I wanted to study Carl Jung and what the people that understood what gave people's lives their meaning. And part of the books that I was reading when I was in my post-coma exploration, I had discovered ancient metaphysical philosophy. I read a book called The Greek Miracle that started talking about the seismic transformation that happened with Plato and Socrates, how there was a new way of understanding the world, and how important they felt it was to look up at the night sky and wonder and question our lives and question what we're here for. And that was the exact same journey that I had been on. I was now questioning everything and what's the nature of human existence, what's the nature of consciousness. You know, being in the near-death experience puts you in that precipice of curiosity. So I got into this doctoral program, and my doctoral dissertation became, I did a study where I took a bunch of participants, I conducted a study where people immersed themselves into Greek metaphysical philosophy, and I wanted to see what happens after 8 weeks of really immersing yourself in deep exploration in the classical sense. And there was a tool that I used. There was a way that you measure, it was a standardized tool, and I found that people that did this journey had a better sense of understanding of their life, their purpose in life, felt better about themselves. There was a psychological benefit to philosophy. So philosophy wasn't just an arcane, boring thing with a bunch of old white men in togas. It could be transformative if you lived it. And what I discovered as a native Greek was that the ancients philosophy was meant to be lived, not debated. And so the love of wisdom, philosophia, meant that you embodied a way of living that was, so let me backtrack. Pythagoras, who would come to influence Plato, was a metaphysical philosopher. And we all know the poor guy for a squared plus b squared equals c squared. But Pythagoras was a mystic who believed that you could see the face of God through the language of mathematics. And that mathematics was not ways you quantify things, but it was a transcendent capacity to understand the infinite, what some might call the divine or sacred geometry. And so he had a community of followers, and I didn't know this until I really drilled into it. He had a community of followers, men and women, which was rare in the ancient world to have women on equal footing.
Right, exactly.
They would wake up and they would engage in physical practice because they believed in the sound body, and then they would do musical meditations. They would play the lyre and the harmonic vibrations. They would do contemplative meditations on sound, because sound has a harmonic, he called it the music of the spheres, that if you could understand vibration, I call him the first Brian Greene. He was string theorist before string theorists had come out. He understood that the universe was harmonic and that music and math had a language that connected. And so they would do these meditations together, and then they also believed in right action, that to have your instrument, we as human beings in alignment, we needed to live correctly. So we couldn't be a well-tuned lyre unless we thought correctly, lived correctly. They were vegetarians. They believed in reincarnation. They believed in the transmigration of souls. So all this really spoke to me, and I thought that there would be a transformative benefit to follow that path, and I did my version of that. I moved out to the North Fork of Long Island at that point, and my wife, who I had met a woman who became my wife, was a school teacher, and she taught while I was finishing up my social work degree, and then I started doing this Pythagorean way of living, and it became my dissertation. And my dissertation did well. I was asked to present it at the American Psychological Association conference in San Francisco, and then I was asked to write a book about it. And so I wrote a book called How Plato and Pythagoras Can Save Your Life, how deep immersion into that kind of wisdom can be life-changing. So then I was asked to teach at a school in Palo Alto at a doctoral program in psychology, where this was my expertise as well. So while I'm teaching, I also started working in the field of addiction. I had moved out to the east end of Long Island. Originally we were on the North Fork. So I started working at the rehab at Eastern Long Island Hospital. I'm teaching at Stony Brook. I'm writing these books. I have a private practice where I'm working with people who are struggling with addiction and existential crises. So I'm doing all this work. I'm working a lot of jobs at this point because I'm an addict and I overdo things. And I started working with school districts. I started working with some of the local school districts at this point. Now we're talking about 2006, 7, 2008, maybe 15 years ago. And I'm working at school districts, and I'm beginning to see now young people who are showing signs of addiction, but they're showing signs of a new kind of an addiction. Now I'm a recovering addict, so I know the signs of addiction because I've been working with substance addiction. But now I started seeing the devices and the gravitational pull, but not only just the gravitational pull, not just the habituation to the devices, but what was this addiction doing to these kids, to their sense of curiosity. These kids weren't cutting school to go to the Museum of Natural History like I was. These kids were profoundly numbed, apathetic, not curious, addicted, self-conscious, egocentric, not self-conscious, self-centered, not reflective. And so I started, and that's sort of what opened up the door to, I started asking some of my colleagues, have you noticed that maybe these devices can be a little problematic for kids? And at that time, again, 2007, 2008, we, the adults in the room, including my clinical colleagues, we were too busy saying, hey, aren't these phones great? We were all too in love with our own phones to realize these kids are kind of changing because of these devices. And that was the segue into, I guess, that chapter of my life, which led to me writing this book and to become one of the country's foremost experts on the impact of the digital age on our mental health.
And so, how do you get people to stop?
Wait, I thought that's next episode, the solution. Well, the first battle was to raise awareness that this was a thing. Because remember, back again, when I'm discovering this thing, the world is still, the emperor has no clothes. You know,
Yes, there's still an awe of it.
I'm Paul Revere, and no one's listening. I wrote, at the same time Glow Kids came out. Glow Kids came out 2016. And I've had over 200 peer-reviewed studies in it, and I wanted it to be a handbook to really legitimize, look, this is not just somebody's opinion. There's a lot of clinical data that shows how the intersection of technology and children leads to increased anxiety, depression, ADHD, aggression. There's a whole host of clinical concomitants that are coming with this, and we're not tuned into this. And so I wrote an op-ed for the New York Post called Digital Heroin. And Digital Heroin, when it came out, blew up. It was the most read article in the New York Post that year, 7 million views and shares. And it was really Digital Heroin, that op-ed, that got me on Good Morning America and on the Today Show in 2020 and a lot of national media, because the question was, really, Dr. Karadaras, is this like heroin? Now, as a recovering heroin addict, which I didn't disclose. I wouldn't say that when I went on national TV at the time. But my point was, this can be as habit forming. I'm not saying it's as lethal, but I'm saying these devices and these platforms have an equal impact on the brain. And at that point, MRI studies were beginning to come out that were showing the brain imaging of children on screens were the same as drug addicts on screens. It was affecting the prefrontal cortex in the same way. It was infecting a whole host of issues, and there was black and white MRI imaging to show that. That was the game changer, right? Clinical presentations can be subjective, but now we had MRI imaging side by side that we could compare and say, oh my God, the neurophysiology of the brain is changing in ways comparable to substance addiction. So I was one of the first people to sort of, hey, let's look at these studies. And that op-ed really was instrumental. It caught a cultural moment, and then Glow Kids caught on fire. It's in 12 languages today, and it's in Chinese, and
That's this book.
the book that you're holding, because at that point it was, there had been maybe one or two other around the edges, but this was the primer, the book that said, here's what can happen with too much screen time. And since then, there has been a grassroots awakening where I think a lot of parents and adults who had been so in love with our devices said, maybe I need to be a little bit more cautious and more aware of what the impact is. Maybe we need to be looking at this more closely.
Yes, it wasn't just keeping somebody, your little child, out of the street and, in a safe place. It's not such a safe place.
Well, I think there were two things that happened. I think the adults in the room conflated modern screens with television. So we thought, all right, TV wasn't so bad for us growing up. How bad can these little TVs be? Mistake number one, because the main thing I talk about when you look at the research is that modern screens, because of their immersive and interactive nature, are much more psychodynamically impactful. So because you're in the experience rather than the viewer of the experience, it's much more profoundly affecting. And they're also very highly dopaminergic. They raise dopamine levels, and adrenergic. So these are like stimulants.
Tell them what dopamine is.
So dopamine is the feel-good neurotransmitter. It's the neurotransmitter most associated with addiction. There's other neurotransmitters. There's serotonin, and there's...
These are substances produced by the brain.
Right. So dopamine is produced by the brain, and dopamine itself had an evolutionary component to it. Dopamine is released when we eat and when we procreate, and it incentivizes those two life-sustaining activities where we have to keep alive by eating and by having sex. But things like substance abuse and screen abuse hijack the dopamine. It's called the dopamine reward loop. So when dopamine gets released, it feels good, and our brain wants to chase that feel-good high. And so it's called so mesolimbic. Mesolimbic is that reward part of the brain that gets activated, and then it goes into a feedback loop. And so screen time and substance addiction have no benefit to us. They don't keep us alive. They don't serve any ostensible benefit other than the fact that we can become habituated to them. And so what they found was that, well, first of all, it activates that mesolimbic dopamine reward loop in the same way that cocaine or heroin does. But it also does damage to the physiological part of the brain that allows us to make good decisions, to not be impulsive. So the part of our brain that's the decision-making part of the brain is the prefrontal cortex right behind our forehead. And that part controls our decision-making. It's called the executive functioning part of our brain. As a teacher, we know that the executive functioning is the master of our brain. And what they found in chronic substance abuse studies and screen addiction studies is that two things happen. The DGM is called the dense gray matter of the brain, actually begins to shrink. So it compromises your decision-making ability. It makes you more impulsive, less able to make good decisions. So in chronic substance abuse and excessive screen time, your decision-making organ is shrunk. And the white matter, the myelin sheath of the brain, also becomes compromised, becomes brittle. And the myelin sheath is the connectivity of the brain. It's like dementia and Alzheimer's are myelination disorders. The myelin sheath begins to break up. The myelin sheath is, we call it the insulation cable of the brain. I've taught neuropsychology. That's one of the things I taught at the doctoral level. I taught neuropsychology. And the myelin sheath is a white lipid, the white matter of the brain, that allows our axons and our neurons to communicate with each other. And if those begin to crumble, which they do in addiction, substance and screen, then the brain connectivity begins to be impacted. So now you have more issues with things like what we've talked about. Screen time, if nothing else, has wired our entire generation of kids coming up for impulsivity. Screen time has made kids much more impulsive. If nothing else, it's made them much more impulsive, and impulsivity correlates to a whole host of other problems like addiction and, because let's face it, the instant gratification on demand model, right? We have people that are binging on Netflix, they want Netflix on demand, but what it does is if you've compromised that part of your brain that allows you to not be impulsive, you're going to be a much more highly impulsive person, and impulsive people don't tend to have good future outcomes in their lives. And that was shown by the Marshmallow Test. The Marshmallow Test was a developmental test years ago that they developed where they would ask 5 and 6 year olds, do you want a marshmallow? Or if you delay gratification, if you don't take this marshmallow, you could have 2 tomorrow. And what we found was that as kids get older and their frontal cortex develops more, they have a better sense of delayed gratification. And the kids who scored better on the Marshmallow Test had better successful outcomes as they got older. Because what we've discovered is being able to delay gratification is one of the key skills that we need to be successful. And if you don't have the ability to delay gratification, if you're a highly impulsive person, bad things happen. And what we're seeing is ADHD rates have skyrocketed in the digital age. 100% spikes in ADHD by some estimates. So, and when I taught, well, anybody who has or works with kids sees it. Kids who are on screens are much more highly impulsive. They're not able to sit still and be bored. They need to be stimulated, entertained, because the other idea is we've habituated them to high impact stimulation. So a kid who's raised at age 2 on a tablet and has all these bells and whistles and information overload or too much stimulation, they become stimulation dependent. So now absent the stimulation, that child can't sit still. So now they need something to hypnotize them with. And so we've primed these kids for impulsivity. And I see it both in my treatment programs that I've opened up and both as a university professor. I saw it as each cohort that I dealt with that got further into the digital culture. You saw, wow, this group is much more impulsive than last year's group. And last year's group was much more focused than the year after them. So these are significant impacts that we're having. In addition to, we haven't even talked about the depression and anxiety part.
And of course, there's also, with this, almost like a loss of a generation of children. And what will this mean to our culture? What will happen to art? What will happen to politics and government if these children are not able to function? I mean,
well, so those profound questions. This toxin, and I call it now a toxin very comfortably. The new book that I've just written is called Digital Madness, and it really looks more at social media. Because social media now, I believe, is changing the ability of young people to critically think and to discern and, disinformation and all the like. Yeah, what happens to our society if we've raised kids who are hyper impulsive, narcissistic, swimming at the shallow end of the pool intellectually, are living to just be stimulated, but not to be deep thinkers, but just to be stimulation seeking, and aren't as empathic. The other thing you see, they're not as creative and they're not as empathic. Creativity is a developmental window like languages. And if we don't have kids developing their creativity during key times in their childhood, that muscle never develops, just like kids who are feral children don't develop language and their lifelong compromised language with acquisition. We see the same thing with creativity, because what's happened is the thing that creates creativity neurosynaptically is boredom. If a child is bored and they're forced to entertain themselves by using their active imagination. So when you use your imagination, you're creating neurosynaptic pathways of internal imagery. But we've taken children, we've drilled a hole in their heads, and we've poured baked in imagery. So a child who's raised on all these devices, they don't have to do any heavy lifting to imagine. They don't read a book and then visualize what they're reading. The visualization is baked in for them through the screen. So that ability atrophies. And when I've worked with kids who were little on screens, it's heartbreaking how uncreative they are, how uninterested they are. The other thing that's happened now, well, we could.
Well, we'll have to go on and find out what are some of the other things. You got another book coming out?
Yes, well, that talks about, because Glow Kids was, hey, young people can get addicted to devices and they can get depressed and anxious and ADHD, but now it's how's the society being changed by things like social media, and this goes back to things like democracy and critical thinking and civics and citizenship and all those kinds of issues.
Wow. All I gotta say is, holy mackerel, you certainly paint quite a picture of this whole phenomena of the screen and what it does to our society, really. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about our children who are our future. And it's really,
Yeah.
thank you for coming, my God.
Thank
I
you for
don't
having
think
me.
I'm going to get over it. Holy mackerel.
Thank you for having me.
It's amazing. I can't wait for the next book.